Anyone who knows me can tell you I've been obsessed with Breaking Bad ever since I first started watching it in 2010. I had written a short blog post about the show after it ended, and my thesis was that in many ways, while the American novel for much of the 20th century had been the defining cultural product, the TV show had replaced it in the 21st. Books like Gone with the Wind, The Great Gatsby, The Grapes of Wrath, and The Catcher in the Rye explored the psyche of America throughout American history, but by the late 20th century, TV had replaced most American reading time. Breaking Bad fits the paradigm of those novels by presenting a moral debate specific to the material conditions of America. The show is instantly relatable to all Americans, since most of us know how corrupt the healthcare and legal industries are, how shitty and monotonous corporate life can be, how federal agencies can be untrustworthy, and how the idea of morality itself in America is rife with contradiction, as our laws don't seem to match a specific moral purpose, but rather seem like an arbitrary standard to protect the powerful. But as American as all this is, as I have done a deep dive into German philosophers since the start of this year for a separate project, I started to recall how much of German culture or ideas were in Breaking Bad. The contradictions between natural law and civic law is something nearly every German philosopher in the 19th century thought about. And knowing Vince Gilligan as a creator, and how intricately the storyline of Breaking Bad was created, I started thinking to myself, this must have been a choice. So I rewatched Breaking Bad for the 14th and 15th time this year, collecting all the references to Germany, and with the help of AI, I made a stunning discovery. Breaking Bad is a show that directly parallels World War II as its allegorical structure, a struggle between Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill, embodied in the show's protagonist, who turns into the show's antagonist, Walter White. Hollywood using the Nazis as an allegory is nothing new. In Star Wars, there are literal stormtroopers with the fascist Emperor Palpatine. V for Vendetta sports a fascist Northfire government in a dystopian UK. And The Hunger Games displays its capital with a decadent elite and peacekeepers, drawing on Nazi spectacle. However, no show has taken the allegory to this extent, while also making it extremely unapparent by even using deception itself as a meta-commentary of the Nazis, who are typically portrayed as boorish and brutish evil, instead of the manipulative and calculating nature of the actual Nazis in history. While some of the details might be speculative, especially with the more ancillary characters, and the timeline may not precisely match the events, there's more than enough to suggest that it would be astronomically unlikely for this all to be a coincidence. I'll first start by showing the German and World War II references. Then I'll run through the themes contained in the pilot. Then I'll match each plot point to its historical event. And finally, I'll reveal which historical figure or group each character represents. This will be a two-part series, where I will not only analyze Better Call Saul, but give my own conclusions as to what this all means for America today. Ever since World War II, German culture has always been associated with the Nazis. American pop culture either toyed with Nazi allegory as a stand-in for authoritarian villains and regimes, or used its icons in youth rebellion culture, like punk rock in the 1970s. However, it is rare to see German culture presented in a more subtle or nuanced manner in America, with either neutral or even positive overtones. But Germany is also where Karl Marx is from, who developed communist theory in the 19th century, something that is almost never associated with Germany today by mass media. This is because after McCarthyism, American media had been reoriented to only talk about Germany's connection to Nazism, and to squelch any sort of conversation about its connection to Marx as much as possible. The references in Breaking Bad and the Nazis is not a new discovery. Every nuance and crevice of this show has been analyzed to the nth degree, and people have already discussed the obvious references, such as Heisenberg being a Nazi scientist, or the literal neo-Nazi group in the show's final season. However, these references are not just solo Easter eggs for history buffs, or mere coincidences, as Gilligan claims. They point to a greater thematic encapsulation of a commentary on American capitalism and its relation to Nazi Übermensch ideas. Walter White's name itself has been examined by characters in the show as WW, which in addition to referring to Woodrow Wilson and Walt Whitman, could also mean World War. When you watch the series again with this in mind, you find explicit references to both world wars and Germany throughout the show itself. Each one on its own would be circumstantial, since it is common for people to reference World War II in America for dramatic effect. But when taken all together, it paints a definitive picture, as World War II was quite literally the existential battle between Nazism and Marxism. Let's run down all of the references to Germany and the World Wars that I found in the show after the pilot. The first obvious clue are the German last names of most of the main white characters, except for the whites, which Gilligan specifically said was a reference to Reservoir Dogs, as the characters Mr. White and Mr. Pink turn their guns on each other in the film, though the conscious change from Pink to Pinkman makes it a German name as well. And these are somewhat esoteric German last names: Hank and Marie Schrader, Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, Gail Bedecker, Saul Goodman, Mike Ehrmantraut, George Merkert, Ted Beneke, Tyrus Kitt, Dan Waxberger, and Jack Welker. The Hispanic characters, of course, all have Spanish last names, with the exception of Gus Fring, who also curiously has a German last name, despite being Chilean. Chemistry itself had been a science dominated by German scientists. From 1901 to 1939, German scientists had won 16 Nobel Prizes in chemistry, while the UK had 7, and France had 4. From 1880 to 1914, Germany had trained 10,000 PhDs in chemistry, while the United States only had trained 500. German chemists discovered oxygen, stoichiometry, atomic theory, electrochemical cells, organic synthesis, the periodic tables, pharmaceuticals, dyes, structural theory, quantum chemistry, and polymers. Essentially, before the rise of the Nazis, Germany was the unquestioned leader in chemistry in the world. Werner Heisenberg, besides being the head of the Nazis' nuclear weapons research program, developed a significant theory in chemistry known as the uncertainty principle, a nod to Walt's unpredictability. Then there are odd choices and references to German culture throughout the show as well. Jesse Pinkman's band Twathammer is spelled with umlaut accents over the U, which is a totally unnecessary accent, but gives it a pseudo-Germanic spelling. The band itself is described as an alt-emo thrash metal group. During the 1970s and 1980s, Germany had a significant heavy metal rock scene, developing trends such as thrash metal. Jesse's own song in the show, Fallacies, has several references to the Nazis, such as "Your eyes burn like daggers through the triumph of my will," and "Works makes free, they're telling me. I've got no place to start. Oh, how do I escape you, little Führer of my heart?" The first quote refers to Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film for the Nazis, called The Triumph of the Will, and "Work makes free" is a slogan the Nazis put in the entrance to concentration camps, while Führer is the official title of the political position of Adolf Hitler, meaning leader. Later, when Jesse is working for Gus, he complains about his working conditions to a drug rehab therapy group, to which the counselor references Franz Kafka, saying that what Jesse is experiencing is Kafkaesque. Franz Kafka was a German-language, Jewish-Czech novelist who played with realism and the absurd, where his protagonists would often deal with strange situations from surreal bureaucracy and oppressive systems, mirroring Jesse's time in the lab. German cars also figure heavily into the series, typically signaling wealth through morally compromised means, both legal and illegal. Ken the finance bro has a BMW that Walt torches. The Salamanca twins leave their Mercedes-Benz with a random Native American family. Ted Beneke has an old BMW and later purchases a Benz with Skylar's money meant for the IRS. And even kleptomaniac Marie drives a Volkswagen Beetle. There are a few exceptions to this, such as Walt and Saul, who drive American cars, highlighting them as ciphers for the audience. Gretchen drives a British Bentley, representing establishment wealth. And finally, Gus drives a Swedish Volvo, a more under-the-radar expression of wealth. Finally, there are just some choices in general that on their own don't seem too out of the ordinary, but taken together it almost feels like there's a bit too much emphasis on Germany. When Hank is dealing with PTSD, he makes his own German-themed beer called Schrader Brau, which Dean Norris, the actor who plays Hank, actually creates in real life. Then, when examining Gail's file, Hank comes across a music video Gale creates of him singing Major Tom by German artist Peter Schiller on his only album in English, which is supposed to be an unofficial sequel to David Bowie's Space Oddity, a song about the Cold War space race. Gray Matter Technology, the company that Walt founds with Elliot Schwartz, is based on a combination of their last names White and Black, which is derived from the German definition of Schwartz. The conglomerate that Los Pollos Hermanos is a part of, Magical Electromotive, is a German company based in Hanover, Germany. There are probably many more minor German references that I'm missing, but I think this is enough to get the point here. Germany is at the center of this show. Moving on, let's run through direct references to either Marxism, Nazism, or World War II. In Season 1, Episode 3, Jesse dissolves Emilio's body in hydrofluoric acid in order to get rid of the evidence of his murder. In World War II, as the Red Army approached, the Nazis experimented with acid in dissolving bodies from mass graves in order to dispose of the evidence. At some Gestapo prisons, some tortured victims were actually dissolved in bathtubs, though they used steel drums with sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid to prevent the bathtub from melting. Later on in the episode, Jesse puts his finger in the shape of a Hitler mustache to Walt and says, "Heil Hitler, bitch." In Season 1, Episode 4, the Hindenburg disaster is one of Jesse's early drawings as he goes through his childhood memories. In 1937, a German airship burst into flames when it was flying over New Jersey, thus causing the end of the airship era. The airship was named after Paul von Hindenburg, who was then Germany's president. When the Nazis took over in 1933, the development of the airship needed funding from the government, and the Nazis insisted that the swastika be visible on the fins of the airship. The Nazis downplayed the disaster in its own media to its citizens, and while both American and German investigators found no indication of sabotage, numerous conspiracy theories about the disaster propagated due to the heightened political climate of the times. Hindenburg was also the German president who defeated Hitler in the 1932 elections, but later appointed Hitler as chancellor in 1933 to stabilize the country from pressure from the Nazis' growing popularity. When Hindenburg died soon afterwards in 1934, Hitler quickly moved to absorb his powers into his own and created a new title, the Führer. The Hindenburg disaster somewhat is symbolic of this transfer of power, but also foreshadows Hitler's eventual downfall. The date on Jesse's picture says 1994, indicating that it takes place 14 years before the events of the show, which takes place starting in 2008. Hindenburg's presidency first started in 1925, and in 1939 was the invasion of Poland, which will make more sense once we go over the pilot. In Season 1, Episode 7, at Holly's baby shower, when Walt and Hank are having a private moment together, Hank shares a Cuban cigar with Walt that he obtained from an FBI agent, which is illegal, as America has been sanctioning Cuba since 1962, since it became a communist country after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Walt points out the arbitrary nature of what's considered legal and illegal in America, citing the prohibition of alcohol, while Hank counters that methamphetamine used to be sold over the counter, and he hears similar types of arguments from criminals he's busted over time. Later in the episode, when Walt and Jesse are planning on stealing methylamine from a chemical company, Walt uses thermite to break the lock. When Jesse asks about the thermite, Walt references the Gustav gun, an extremely large artillery piece that would be impervious to Allied bombing raids, but would be vulnerable to a small team of commandos with thermite to highlight its effectiveness. The Gustav gun, considered one of the Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, was actually destroyed by the Nazis themselves with explosives to prevent it falling into Soviet hands as the Red Army approached. In the next episode, in Season 2, Episode 1, when Walt and Jesse plot to kill Tuco, Walt produces ricin. Again, when Jesse shows his skepticism, Walt tells the story of how the Soviet KGB used ricin to kill a Bulgarian defector to the West by using a small amount on a point of umbrella gun, which shot a small metal pellet into the victim, who died a few days later from the poison. In Season 2, Episode 7, when Hank is promoted to work in the El Paso office, he asks about a statue of Jesus Malverde on a coworker's desk. Malverde was a Mexican Robin Hood-like folklore figure, revered by Mexican drug dealers. Hank comments that it's like going after neo-Nazis and wearing swastikas. The coworker then references Sun Tzu, a Chinese general and philosopher who wrote The Art of War, quoting that, "If you know the enemy as yourself, you will fight without danger in many battles." This is significant because not only does it foreshadow Hank's lack of insight into Heisenberg as his own brother-in-law, but almost it serves as a meta-commentary of the proxy wars between America and China during the Cold War, how America failed to understand the people they were fighting against and lost despite having superior resources and technology. In the following scene, when Walt meets with Jesse's friends to pick up money at the National Atomic Museum, Badger calls the other two Fat Man and Little Boy, which were the code names of the nukes dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. Later, when Jesse meets up with his friends at the same museum, before the scene starts, the recording talks about Werner Heisenberg heading the German nuclear weapons program. As Jesse pitches his new plan, they are standing in the Cold War section, where the wall behind Jesse displays the fall of communism with the hammer and sickle symbol of the Soviet Union. Immediately afterwards, when Jesse gets back into the car, Walt claims that they are not charging enough, now that they have acquired a monopoly, which is the goal of capitalism. In Season 2, Episode 11, the episode is titled Mandala, which is a significant symbol in the Buddhist tradition. This symbol represents the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which is represented by the death of Combo at the start of the episode, and the birth of Holly, Walt's daughter, at the end. The meaning of this symbol is also similar to the Buddhist swastika, but since Gilligan probably didn't want to make it too obvious, he chose the mandala to give us the hint instead. In addition to the natural cycle of life, the swastika represents the Four Noble Paths of Buddhism and good luck, which is why it was chosen by Hitler to represent the Nazi Party. The birth of Holly is then shown in the next episode titled Phoenix, which is a Greek mythological figure representing a rebirth from the ashes of death, completing the cycle. The Nazis heavily used Greek mythology in their propaganda, as they made the claim that throughout history, the people who created world culture were Aryans, and that they were thus connected to the ancient Greeks. The episode reverses the previous scheme by ending with Jane's death, who we later learn was born in Phoenix, Arizona. Finally, at the start of the next episode, Walt is holding his newborn Holly when he is called by Jesse, who finds Jane dead in the morning. At the end of the episode, it ends with Jane's father, an air traffic controller, who is distracted from the trauma of his daughter and causes a plane crash and the death of hundreds of Albuquerque citizens, highlighting the cycle of death and destruction caused by Walt's decisions. When the next season opens with news of the plane crash in Season 3, Episode 1, we find that there are exactly 167 victims. This mirrors the Białystok ghetto action in July of 1943. This event was significant because it was one of the last Polish ghetto liquidations, and caused Heinrich Himmler himself to personally intervene when the move was met with heavy resistance. The 167 were the first of the victims shot in the first 2 days, who were mostly the elderly, sick, and children, too slow to get to the trains for transportation. The entire revolt was significant because it was the final major destruction of Jewish life in northeastern Poland. Gilligan himself claims that Jane's death represents a pivotal moment in Walt's moral descent, from what he describes as a deliberate escalation in his character arc, from a reluctant criminal to someone who is now irredeemable. In Season 3, Episode 2, when Walt is depressed about Skylar finding out about his activities, Saul tries to cheer him up by saying that there are plenty of women from Thailand and the Czech Republic that are just happy to be in America. Thailand had allied with Japan during World War II, while Germany had annexed Czechoslovakia in 1938 as part of the Reich. Both countries are now a cesspool for prostitution and methamphetamine in their respective continents. Later on in the season, in Episode 6, Gale quotes Walt Whitman. Whitman's work generally had themes that celebrated the individual, love of the common man, and racial equality. As a result, Alfred Rosenberg, a chief ideologue within the Nazi Party, called Whitman a degenerate Democrat whose homoerotic verses were corrupting the youth. During the Nazi book burnings, copies of Leaves of Grass were explicitly burned alongside works from Freud, Kafka, and Hemingway, while all German editions of Whitman's work were removed from libraries and bookstores. In Season 3, Episode 9, Jesse complains to Walt about the low pay they are receiving compared to the amount of money Gus is bringing in, claiming that they are being exploited for their labor. Later on, he gets even more incensed when Saul talks to him about the costs of laundering and paying taxes on his money. Saul claims that the government cares more about tax evasion than they do about the actual criminal activity, like drug dealing. Although it seems absurd that someone making millions of dollars a year would be angry about his predicament, it is technically true that Jesse and Walt are both having their surplus value taken from them, as they are technically producing the product to be sold, making them proletariat laborers. Jesse decides to take the extra meth over the quota that they are supposed to produce for Gus in order to sell it to make additional profit. In the very next episode, when Walt insists on killing a fly before getting back to work, Jesse calls Walt Hitler again for the second time in the show, indicating his frustration overall at his predicament of being under the thumb of both Walt's OCD and Gus's exploitation. At the end of the season, we are shown Gale's bookcase, where he has several books of interest. Although Gale declares himself a libertarian to Walt, we find he has copies of Introduction to Marx, Engels, and Marxism by Vladimir Lenin, and Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism by Kusanen, Lawrence, and Wishart. The first book's significance is self-explanatory, but the second significance is that it was considered an official textbook of Marxist-Leninist theory in the Soviet Union when it was published in 1960. This was by far the biggest clue that Breaking Bad is about communism that led me to dig into this theory. In Season 4, Episode 2, Badger and Skinny Pete come over Jesse's place and take meth, and start talking about what the best zombie shooter game is. When they talk about Call of Duty World at War, where there are Nazi zombies, Badger claims that the zombies are the deadliest because they hate Americans like the Taliban. In the show's timeline, the Afghanistan and Iraq wars were ongoing, who are seen as enemies of Israel. In the next episode, when Walt is celebrating with Skyler, he buys a champagne named after Winston Churchill. Churchill loved to drink that champagne so much that the company named it after him. In propaganda and in private conversations, Hitler would often comment how Churchill was a raging alcoholic. In the next episode, when Hank consults with Walt about the case about Gale, he comments that he's been chasing this Heisenberg character, and that Werner Heisenberg was a Nazi scientist. In Season 4, Episode 8, it's revealed that Gus is from Chile, who Hector previously had referred to as Generalissimo in Season 3, Episode 7. Pinochet was a fascist dictator of Chile from 1973 to 1990. In elite private schools during Pinochet's regime, German was taught exclusively, since the military and business elite primarily did business with the German Chilean community. Gilligan himself said that Gus was in the top echelons of the Pinochet regime, and Max claims that Gus had rescued him from the slums of Santiago, so it makes sense that Max would have received his chemistry knowledge from an elite education in Chile in German. However, Gilligan has been tight-lipped as to what exactly Gus was doing, stating that he didn't want to give it away. This told me that there was something significant here. We will examine this further when we get to Gus's character in Part 2 of this series. Near the end of Season 4, Episode 12, Walt's story to Hank is that he can't come to the safe house because he has to run the car wash. When Marie protests that it's unsafe and that Hank should force Walt to come to the safe house, Hank claims, "This isn't Nazi Germany," to which Marie responds, "If I had $1 for every time you said that," implying that Hank often makes references to the Nazis when making a point. This is accurate, as in the next season, Episode 2, when magical executives come to Albuquerque to talk to the DEA, he asks Steve Gomez, "How many krauts we got?" To which Gomez responds, "Enough to invade Poland," making a very distinct World War II reference. In Season 5, Episode 3, Walt and Jesse are watching an episode of The Three Stooges, a Jewish comedy trio that made the first American comedy to satirize Hitler in 1940. In Season 5, Episode 6, after they steal methamphetamine from a train, Todd shoots Drew Sharp, which enrages Jesse, who calls him Ricky Hitler. In the 1950s, singer-actor Ricky Nelson had a clean-cut, innocent, all-American boy next-door image, as Jesse is implying that Todd looks like a harmless Boy Scout, but is really a cold-blooded psychopath. Later in the episode, when Hank inquires about a Judge Papadumian to Gomez, he responds by saying that Papadumian is like Ho Chi Minh, meaning that the judge is strict and by the book, who would not sign off on illegal search warrants or wiretaps. Ho Chi Minh was the uncompromising, no-nonsense, ideological, rigid communist revolutionary that led Vietnam against America during the Vietnam War. In the last episode of the first half of Season 5, Lydia pitches Walt the Czech Republic as a new market that she was originally planning to expand into with Gus. Again, the Czech Republic had been annexed by the Nazi Reich in 1938, which encouraged the use of methamphetamine as a drug to combat fatigue and maintain alertness. Although meth was banned after the war under communist rule, addicts would re-engineer the drug in kitchen labs for private use. After the fall of the Soviet Union, due to this homemade drug culture, a meth crisis would sweep the nation, resulting in the highest per capita use and production of meth in Europe, which made the market attractive to Lydia and Gus. Later in the episode, Walt consults Todd's uncle, Jack Welker, and his neo-Nazi gang to kill Gus's men to prevent them from revealing his identity to the DEA. The overt references to World War II end here, and we will see why no more are made in the second half of the season later on in our analysis. Let's move on to the pilot. Traditionally in television before streaming, there was something known as pilot season, where studios would develop a show by having the creator write the script for the pilot, or the first episode, in addition to other materials in case the studio was interested in picking up the show in order to pitch it. They would produce many of these pilots, and if they tested well, the pilots would get picked up by the distributors for a season order. This is so that the writer doesn't have to write the entire season out before pitching to shows, as most TV shows employ a team of writers that are led by the screenwriter to write the rest of the show. Pilots thus have a lot of information: what the tone of the show will be, how it will look, and the essential hook of the show, often contained in the title or a character statement in the show. Since many pilots don't get picked up, the creator typically makes broad thematic strokes to set up the template of the rest of the show. The Breaking Bad pilot not only sets up the rest of the show, it sets up the beginnings of the allegory. After the opening flash forward, we are introduced to Walt by 2 awards on his wall, one for his work as a high school chemistry teacher, and another from the Science Research Center in Los Alamos, New Mexico, for contributing research towards a Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Los Alamos is also where the Manhattan Project was located. This is to set up the fact that Walt is clearly underachieving in his life, but is also significant since he later chooses Werner Heisenberg, the leader of the Nazi nuclear weapons program, as his alias, which is also mentioned when he meets with Jesse Pinkman's crew at the Nuclear Museum. In the very next shot, we see Walt getting a plate of eggs and veggie bacon assembled into the shape of a 50, as Skylar tells him happy birthday. While its primary function is to highlight Walt's obvious midlife crisis, there is a hidden significance to the fact that he is specifically 50. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, when he was 50 years old. Breaking Bad's pilot takes place on September 8th, and the timeline that passes in the first season to the end of the Tuco arc ends around the beginning of October. For reference, the Nazi invasion of Poland completed on October 6th, 1939. The show was first broadcast on January 20th, 2008, making the date a specific choice, since it didn't take place around the time that it aired, as most TV shows typically do. The 50 is also arranged with veggie bacon, a detail that is not continued for his 51st and 52nd birthdays, meaning that it was likely a specific choice. Hitler claimed that he was a vegetarian, like his hero Richard Wagner, and often talked about how Roman soldiers had a vegetarian diet, which he adopted during the war. Both were also fans of Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher who promoted and introduced some of the teachings of Eastern religions, like Hinduism and Buddhism in the West, which encourage vegetarianism. In the next scene, we catch Walt teaching chemistry for what ostensibly seems like the first day of school, as he is introducing the study of chemistry to his students. In screenwriting, this is typically where the main character states a maxim or philosophy that defines either his character or the show itself, known as the opening theme. Walt declares that chemistry is the study of matter, but I prefer to see it as a study of change. That's all of life, right? It's the constant, it's the cycle, it's solution then dissolution, over and over again. It is growth, then decay, then transformation. This statement can fit into 2 German philosophers, who are for the most part diametrically opposed, as their philosophies led to Marxism and Nazism. The first is Hegel, who in his work The Philosophy of Nature says, "The chemical process is a transition of one form of individuality into another, where the inner concept of the material manifests itself in its external transformations." Walt's statement also fits Hegel's dialectical process, in which concepts and historical events develop through a three-step process: thesis, or the state of affairs, or growth; antithesis, a contradictory idea in the thesis, or decay; and finally synthesis, a resolution of the two, creating a new state of affairs and a new thesis, or transformation. This is significant since Hegel's philosophy is the beginning of Karl Marx's journey into developing his own Marxist theory. The second is Nietzsche, whose influence on the show is undeniable, as we will see even later on in the pilot. In Nietzsche's context, Walt's quote could also be about the process of overcoming the self, centered on Walt's transformation into his alter ego Heisenberg. Within this single statement, we can get an idea that Walt starts off with a somewhat positive, optimistic point of view, given his enthusiasm for the actual study of chemistry. But we can see the edges of what's to come when we see his student Chad blatantly disrespecting him during his class, with the follow-up scene showing Walt's humiliation in washing his car at his second job at the car wash. As the show's title is Breaking Bad, this juxtaposition is significant, as it also teases the dual nature of Walt's character as Heisenberg, while also posing the philosophical question of the moral value of bad actions when they are done in service for one's own self in a bad situation, or whether anyone is truly moral at all, and if they purely act out of self-interest. These are significant questions German philosophers throughout the 19th century debated, and their debates unfold throughout the entire show. During the scene back at home for his surprise birthday party, we're introduced to his brother-in-law, Hank Schrader. Immediately we get a stark contrast with Walt's more pathetic demeanor, and one with smart-alecky, almost stereotypical American machismo. The scene starts with Hank showing off his service weapon, and emasculating Walt when he comments on the gun's weight. The emasculation becomes comical when he takes Walt's own beer to make a toast. Then Hank quickly makes the party about him by turning on the television to show the news. Hank is revealed as a DEA agent, as a news report shows him being interviewed during a drug bust. Walt immediately shows interest when he sees money on the table, and you could see the wheels turning in his head. When he asks Hank about it, Hank emasculates him again by suggesting that he should come with him on a ride-along to get some excitement in his visibly bland and boring life. The show introduces a sense of tension with Hank as an obvious future antagonist. But the key here is methamphetamine. Before Breaking Bad, TV shows primarily centered on much more commonly known drugs, such as heroin and cocaine. Talk about meth use was extremely rare, making it a very specific choice. Methamphetamine was synthesized in 1893 by a Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi, and later explored in the 1920s for medical applications such as treating asthma, narcolepsy, and obesity, due to its stimulant properties. By the 1930s, it started to be commercialized as an over-the-counter treatment for fatigue, kind of like a 5-hour energy drink in a pill. Methamphetamine became extremely popular in the late 1930s, particularly in Germany. In 1937, Temerl Werk introduced Pervitin, a methamphetamine tablet that was marketed as a miracle drug to enhance mood, concentration, and physical endurance. By 1939, over 35 million tablets had been consumed in Germany, encouraged by the Nazis in promotion of physical strength and mental superiority, while drugs like cocaine and heroin were criminalized. But the biggest connection to World War II for meth is its use by both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Before the invasion of Poland, the High Command of the Nazi Wehrmacht ordered widespread distribution of meth to their troops through chocolate bars called Panzerchokolade, or tank chocolate. Suppressing sleep, hunger, and fear, troops were able to march 60 kilometers a day, enabling them to make rapid advances, crushing France in just 6 weeks in 1940, but using 72 million doses in order to do so. Hitler himself started taking meth in 1941 for anxiety, since the invasion of the Soviet Union was the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. Meth most likely contributed to Hitler's deteriorating health, causing Parkinson's-like symptoms and fatigue, while also worsening his erratic decision-making in the final years of the war. Imperial Japan's military also used Philipon, a Japanese brand of meth, on an extremely large scale, as they had factory workers use it to meet wartime production quotas. Over 1 billion doses had been manufactured by the end of the war. In addition to using it with the military, kamikaze pilots, who are sometimes brainwashed Korean prisoners of war, would take massive doses of the 50 milligrams before suicide missions to maintain focus and suppress fear. While America and Britain also used meth, which were called wakey-wakey pills during the Normandy invasion, it was a tiny fraction of the use of either the Axis powers. After the war, Germany faced a meth epidemic, which also explains the Czech Republic's demand for meth, a fact that is later exploited by Walt working with Lydia. The next day, we see Walt working at the car wash, when all of a sudden, as he's about to faint and collapse, he sees the back of a woman in a bright green dress getting into a green BMW. The writers never explain who this woman is, and she never appears in any episode ever again, leading some fans to speculate that it is a reference to The Great Gatsby. Typically, this was meant to be more of a literary reference, paralleling Gatsby chasing after the green light that represented his love for Daisy, but also after money. While in Breaking Bad, the color green has similar undertones, especially since Walt and Gatsby are both dealers of illicit substances and suffer similar consequences for their actions. The Great Gatsby is a classic existentialist story about the meaning of wealth, crime, and capitalist decadence, taking place during the height of capitalism in the 1920s, shortly before the Great Depression, representing capitalism's ultimate collapse. For the German connection, aside from her BMW, The Great Gatsby coincidentally was published in 1925, the same year Mein Kampf was published, and was never a success during Fitzgerald's life, who died in 1940, but ironically exploded in popularity during World War II, when copies were given to soldiers at war. Additionally, Meyer Wolfsheim is a significant character in the book as a Jewish bootlicking gangster based on Arnold Rothstein, an actual Jewish mafia don. Wolfsheim represents the moral corruption of Gatsby's wealth. Walt then confronts the news that he has lung cancer from his doctor. As a trauma response, he points out the mustard on his shirt. While not important on its own, it does highlight Walt's OCD and need for control. We see many more instances of Walt's OCD throughout the show, but most notably the ongoing obsession with the purity of his product, somewhat mirroring the Nazi desire for pure Aryan stock. And as we shall see later on, the choice of it being a mustard stain may imply something else. With the news of the diagnosis, we see Walt in a daze as he flips out at his boss at the car wash and doesn't tell his wife about the diagnosis, while sadly flipping matches into a pool. Finally, he calls Hank to accept his offer for a ride-along. We find out that the suspect's name is Emilio Koyama. While he is half Mexican, it's also significant that he's half Japanese, as not only is this referencing the other Axis power, it highlights the fact that meth was first synthesized by a Japanese chemist, as mentioned before. While Better Call Saul has Vietnamese and other Asian characters, in Breaking Bad, this is the only Asian character in the show, making the choice to make him half Japanese very specific. As they drive over to the house to arrest Koyama, Hank starts to sing Flight of the Valkyries by Richard Wagner, as if he's going into battle. Wagner was infamous for his anti-Semitic diatribe titled Judaism in Music, and he was seen as the progenitor of the proto-Nazi movement in Germany in the 19th century. Although he was primarily a composer, he was involved with the general academia and aristocracy of this time, and was also heavily connected with German thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who is also known as the John the Baptist to Hitler. The Nazis used all of these ideologues as propaganda tools. Hitler was a huge fan of Wagner, regularly attending his operas during his time in Vienna before World War I. Because of the Nazis, Wagner still is seen as a controversial figure, as many point to him as one of Hitler's main inspirations. As they drive over, Hank comments that for safety, agents wear masks, since during the production of meth, mistakes in the lab can lead to poisonous fumes like mustard gas. Walt then corrects him and says that it's actually phosphine gas. This is a writer's choice, that they'd make Hank make this mistake so it appeared in the script, since in World War I, Hitler's defining moment in Mein Kampf was when he was hit with a mustard gas attack in 1918, temporarily blinding him and causing him to learn of Germany's defeat in an army hospital. This ties into Walt's earlier comment about the mustard stain on the doctor's coat. As the DEA is searching the house, Walt watches his old student Jesse Pinkman coming out of the neighbor's house and escaping in a car that clearly shows he was the suspect they were looking for all along. Walt catches up with him at his house and makes a proposition: either partner up with him or he turns him in. During the scene, we can hear a faint train in the background, mirroring the trains going to Nazi concentration camps in Poland, where prisoners were taken for forced labor to produce war materials. The Nazis also forced prisoners to manufacture methamphetamine in Germany, as Walt is forcing Jesse the same under penalty of imprisonment. This may also subtly represent Hitler's initial drive into Poland, as mentioned before, with Walt turning 50, and working with a puppet government to control the country. As Walt brings his lab equipment to Jesse, we get a second look at Walt's OCD. Here we see him obsessing about cleanliness and the purity of the product in order to perform as advertised. While this somewhat works within the show's internal logic, that more purity means more profit, in general, drug dealing doesn't necessarily follow the same dictates of classical economics, since both supply and demand can be erratic and cause massive fluctuations in price, even if the drug is not 100% pure. This likely means that it was yet another specific choice Gilligan made, and strengthens the case that is meant to parallel Hitler's obsession with race purity. As Walt gathers the funds to buy an RV, Jesse asks him why he's going to break bad at the age of 60, to which Walt again corrects him, saying that he's 50, the fourth time this is mentioned in the pilot. In film and TV, when a character says the title of the show, a theme is declared, to which Walt responds, "I am awake." Going back to Walt's previous comments about chemistry, we see that he has made a choice, as Nietzsche's philosophy most clearly resembles this sentiment. Walt's statement is essentially a moment where Walt rejected the slave morality of his submissive life, and begins to assert his will to power through illicit means as Nietzsche's Übermensch, as Walt transforms from a passive chemistry teacher into Heisenberg. Martin Heidegger, another German philosopher who was part of the Nazi Party, expounded on this concept, and believed that authentic existence arises from confronting your mortality, since it reveals all the superficial things as distractions, while sharpening one's focus to live deliberately and with purpose. While Heidegger would later denounce Nazism, the Nazis used his philosophy as a major ideological tool for their propaganda. In the very next scene, we can see precisely Nietzsche's will to power in action, as Walt Jr. is being bullied while the family is out shopping. Walt violently attacks the bully, even with his much smaller and weaker stature, challenging him to a fight. The bully backs down, not wanting to cause a scene. We see even Skylar getting turned on by this, while Walt clearly enjoys his newfound confidence. Finally, we return to the pilot flash forward, as Walt and Jesse begin their first cook. As a deal with Crazy 8 goes south, Walt is forced to come up with a plan to save his and Jesse's lives, saying that he will cook for them if they let them both live. Instead, he creates a chemical process that produces phosphine gas, as he previously mentioned to Hank, which kills Emilio instantly. We now catch up to the opening scene, as Walt drives the RV through the desert maniacally while wearing a gas mask. As this is the first image of Walt we see in the entire pilot, we can now bring Hitler's mustard gas attack into full picture, as the gas masks look like German ones deployed during World War I, as both the Allies and Central Powers used chemical weapons in trench warfare. While there are some gas masks today that cover the entire face, most modern gas masks, especially for high school chemistry labs, do not, since it impairs vision, which they use safety goggles for. Again, this is indicative of a specific choice, meaning that the connection with World War I is highly likely. Walt quickly takes a video of himself, and we are introduced to the main character, Walter White. While not immediately apparent, as mentioned before, much is made over Walt's initials later on for a plot point, and it's clear now that WW refers to World War. As Walt believes the police are en route, he attempts to kill himself with Crazy 8's gun, but cannot even do that since he misfires as the safety is on, but then loses the nerve to actually follow through when he fires off a shot. When he sees that the cops are actually fire trucks responding to a fire that they had caused earlier, he hides the gun. This moment is very similar to Hitler himself, who famously committed suicide as Berlin was being stormed by the Red Army, but also claimed that suicide was a way to preserve honor in defeat to the Wehrmacht, and ended up following his own dictates, shooting himself with a pistol. Cyanide pills were also distributed to the Nazi elite, so that they could easily kill themselves in the event that they were captured. We catch up with Walt back at home, literally laundering money. This is a subtle detail. We realize that in the chaos of his escape, Walt still had the presence of mind to take Crazy 8's money, which had been left on Crazy 8's car before the gas attack. When he settles into bed with Skylar, he responds to her growing concerns of his reserved behavior by engaging in sex, something that was previously implied hadn't happened in a long time. It is apparent that Walt's transformation has now begun. While not part of the initial pilot, there is a flashback scene near the end of the series in the Ozymandias episode that takes place in the pilot's timeline during Walt and Jesse's first cook and retains the pilot's thematic continuity. While its primary function is to provide a touchpoint for long-term viewers to remember how much more innocent the show was in the beginning, we can see for the first time Walt, new to Breaking Bad, sharpening his skills of deception, rehearsing lines that he would say to Skylar as an excuse to why he would be home late. After Hitler's release from prison in 1925, the Nazi Party took a different tack, deciding to try to go through the electoral process to legitimize a party. Hitler realized that if he was to be successful, he needed to craft a public persona for himself to build an image of mystique and grandeur, as Hitler did not have any traditional markers of authority from his background that his political rivals did. The Nazi Party also knew that they would have to use deception in their rhetoric, and that Hitler would need practice to deliver untruthful sentiments convincingly. In order to capture the German masses, they presented Hitler as an unknown soldier to be relatable to millions of other German veterans, as most other politicians were stuffy old men who the Nazis knew they could present as boring or out of touch and spoke monotonously. The Nazis wanted to put on a show. As a result, Hitler would practice poses in the mirror, rehearse speeches with the Nazi playwright, and analyze photographs of himself to create the image of a man of action. Hitler had ordered these photos to later be destroyed, but his personal photographer had kept them and published them after the war. You can see that just like Walt, Hitler does seem a bit awkward in his beginnings until he starts winning elections in the 1930s and starts hitting his stride. So from the pilot alone, we find Walt tracing Hitler's footsteps at various points from 1918 to 1939, mirroring Hitler's will to power from World War I to leading the invasion of Poland. We can also see from the pilot's focus on personal finances, the American healthcare system, and the Great Gatsby reference that there are hints of Marxist ideology embedded in the show as well, though we do not yet meet Gus Fring and his network, representing the Soviet Union. And one last tidbit, for Hitler's own 50th birthday, which was then made a national holiday in Nazi Germany, Hitler was given a large collection of Richard Wagner's handwritten opera manuscripts, which he adored and carried with him all throughout the war, even into his final bunker. At this point, I hope I've made the case that Vince Gilligan intended for Walt to represent Adolf Hitler. So before we go any further, you need to meet the real person whose psychological blueprint we just watched activate in the Albuquerque desert. Most of us picture Hitler as a born demon. History class, movies, memes, he's pure evil from the cradle. The truth is far more disturbing. Adolf Hitler is a failed art student from a small Austrian town. Orphaned at 18, he was twice rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts while living in homeless shelters and selling watercolor postcards on the street. He was essentially a modern-day New York bohemian, trolling Parsons while making street art in Times Square to make ends meet. One of his best customers? Ironically enough, a Jewish art dealer. Broken friendless, he dodged the Austrian draft because he didn't want to serve with inferior races. When he moved to Munich in 1913, he remained a nobody. World War I saves him. He volunteers the day it breaks out, serves as a trench runner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the Western Front, surviving many near-death experiences while being awarded an Iron Cross for bravery, ironically again, by a Jewish superior officer. Blinded by British mustard gas in 1918, he learns in a hospital bed that Germany has surrendered. He later writes that he fell to his knees and wept for the first time since his mother's death. Something switches on in that hospital. Destiny, he says, spared him for a reason. Discharged and broke again, the army keeps him on as a political spy. He infiltrates a tiny extremist group called the German Workers' Party, but when he likes what he hears, he joins. And then he seizes control. He reinvents himself as a mesmerizing speaker and designs the party flag himself. He attempts a coup in 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, which fails spectacularly. Charged with high treason, he somehow only gets 9 months in a cushy prison. Writes Mein Kampf there, the blueprint for everything to come. Out of prison, and banned from public speaking at first, he rebuilds the party legally. The Great Depression hits. Germany is starved, humiliated, and 6 million unemployed. Hitler, the homeless painter nobody wanted, suddenly looks like the only man with a plan. By 1932, he is flying across Germany in his own plane, 5 cities a day, promising pride, jobs, and revenge. Comes second in the presidential election, but the Nazis are now the biggest party in the Reichstag. Old elites think they can control him. In January 1933, they make him chancellor. In August 1934, the president dies, and Hitler merges the offices. He is now Führer, absolute power in 18 months. Step by step, he cancels reparations, rebuilds the army in secret, remilitarizes the Rhineland, annexes Austria, swallows Czechoslovakia, each time the world blinks. He stages fake Polish attacks on German soil to give himself the pretext. September 1st, 1939, age 50, he invades Poland. This is the real arc of Hitler. He is an overlooked loser. The war gives him purpose. Betrayal and humiliation flip the switch. Prison gives him a manifesto. Economic collapse makes him a savior. And pride and destiny erase every restraint. One moral compromise at a time until the tanks roll. Sound familiar? A high school chemistry teacher, Nobel-level talent, passed over and underpaid, crawling through life in a desert suburb. One terminal diagnosis. One hospital moment where he decides the world owes him. One first cook that feels like destiny is sparing him. One manifesto, I am awake. One economic anxiety trigger, his medical bills as reparations. One empire built on pride and purity. One final season where the masks are off and the machine gun is in the trunk. There was a part of Hitler that genuinely believed he was saving Germany. There was a part of Walt that genuinely believed he was doing it for his family. The difference is Walt eventually says it out loud. He did it for himself, and he liked it. Walter White didn't just turn into a drug lord. He turned into the exact psychological profile that produced the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. Only this time, the lab was blue, the Reich lasted 2 years, and the Führer died in his own temple, caressing the equipment he loved more than any human being. This is a true character study Vince Gilligan set out to make. Breaking Bad takes place over a 2-year time period, starting on Walt's 50th birthday in the pilot and ending with Walt's 52nd birthday in the finale. While certain events are incongruous with this timeline due to creative liberties, the show analogously follows the events of those 2 years, starting from the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, and essentially ending somewhat after the invasion of the USSR in June 1941. The invasion of Poland was right after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, which was a non-aggression pact between Germany and the USSR. The Breaking Bad timeline generally follows this structure as its own timeline, not the end of the war in 1945. Much of the events are aligned with the exact date mapped from 1939 in the real world to 2008 in the Breaking Bad world. For example, if I say a World War II event happened on September 4th, 1940, then it should be mapped around or on September 4th, 2009 in the Breaking Bad world. In the first season, Walt starts out as a chemistry teacher in the show, who is clearly gifted in the development of cutting-edge Nobel Prize contributing research. In one of Hitler's table talk speeches, he declares that the types of people who become teachers at primary schools are the type that have no chance of success in the independent professions, which is essentially the adage, those who can't do, teach. And in the show itself, it's clear that Walt feels underachieved due to his buyout and gray matter from his business partner, Elliot Schwartz. We meet his wife, Gretchen, first, in a flashback scene where Walt is flirting as they talk about the chemical composition of the human body, and it's clear that they had a relationship prior to the events of the show. As they are now billionaires, Skylar notifies Elliot of Walt's condition before they go to a birthday party, and Elliot offers Walt a job at Gray Matter, as a way for the company to pay for his cancer treatment. Walt is chagrined by this, seeing this as an insult because in his mind, Elliot had betrayed him by stealing not only his research, but his girl, though the story seems clearly revised from his perspective. In his table talk, Hitler mentions a teacher in his youth named Father Schwartz, a strict teacher he used to tease and enrage, noting his long nose. Later in his table talks, he refers to another Schwartz, who was a national treasure of the Nazi Party, praising him for being able to handle the Nazi Party's finances. Schwartz, in addition to meaning black in German, also is a common Ashkenazi Jewish name, which sets the stage for Walt's resentment towards him, as Hitler resented teachers and academics in Vienna, particularly because he believed that Jewish intellectuals in Vienna prevented his rise in the art and architectural world. Walt and Elliot founded Grey Matter sometime in the mid-1980s, which would be around the events of World War I during the real-world timeline, as Elliot said that they were in the trenches. Walt then leaves Grey Matter and Gretchen on July 4th, 1989, when in the real-world timeline is July 4th, 1920. This is when the Nazi Party officially was founded in Germany, calling for the rejection of the Versailles Treaty. He meets Schuyler in 1990, a year later, and Walt Jr. is born in 1992, as Walt Jr. is 16 years old, and comments about getting his learner's permit to drive. 16 years prior to the World War timeline would be 1923, when the Nazi Party attempted its coup of the German government with the beer hall putsch. We also meet Walt's main series antagonist, his brother-in-law, Hank Schrader. Given that the events of the show take place before America's entrance into the war, Hank's character is mapped onto Winston Churchill as an authority figure that wants to maintain the rules-based order. Hitler consistently singled out Churchill as an enemy who was not acting in England's best interests and out of personal pride, as he wanted to ally with England as partners in global domination. Even some fans have noticed a resemblance, as they both have physically dominant larger-than-life appearances, use humor and bravado as armor, drink alcohol as a coping mechanism, and have bulldog attitudes. Churchill was ridiculed in the 1930s for warning about Hitler's rise, as Hank was ridiculed for chasing the ghost of Heisenberg for much of the show. During the first season, Walt is helped many times by Native Americans, who are sometimes held responsible for some of his actions. When Columbus sailed to the Americas over 500 years ago, he was in search of India for their spices, and as a result, called the natives Indians, which stuck with the Native Americans even in the present day. As discussed before, the Indian religion Buddhism had a high significance to the Nazi Party, and because of their actions, the swastika used to be a symbol for good luck and is now associated with death, destruction, and evil. This motif will continue with Hispanic working class characters throughout the show as well, as Hispanic people have Native American blood. The first season was cut short due to a writer's strike in 2007 to 2008, so its arc completes a few episodes into the second season, after the death of Tuco Salamanca. In Hitler's table talks, he often talks about war history and admires the soldier who was able to adapt technology to the needs of war. Walt, of course, had already previously done this with phosphine gas by killing Emilio and Crazy 8, while using hydrofluoric acid to dispose of the evidence. He then uses fulminated mercury in order to intimidate Tuco into paying him the money he was owed. This is also the first time we see Walt viscerally relishing his newfound confidence and power, as he adopts his alter ego as Heisenberg. With his growing confidence, he uses thermite to break into the chemical plant to steal methamphetamine. Things immediately go south when Tuco murders one of his men by accident in front of Walt and Jesse, who are unsure how to deal with the situation. Walt again uses science by making ricin in order to poison Tuco, but before their plan can be executed, Tuco kidnaps them both and tells Walt that he has connections in Mexico where he will use Walt as a cook and the Federales would not interfere. This is essentially Franco's Spain, a regime aided by Italy and Germany in the 1930s. Ever since the fall of the Colombian cartels in the 1990s, Mexican cartels have gained significant influence in Mexico through corruption and bribery and sometimes operate with cooperation from the state itself. Mexico has become a pseudo-fascist state where cartels and their financial interests run large parts of the country. Enlisting a top chemist like Walt could further solidify the cartel's power and influence in Mexico, which mirrors Nazi Germany's aid to Franco's regime against the anti-fascist resistance. The final clue of the first season's arc is the blue meth, when he starts cooking meth with methylamine, instead of the standard way it is cooked in Albuquerque, with pseudoephedrine. Meth is a clear crystal, regardless of the way it is cooked. Blue meth doesn't actually exist in real life, but it is used to essentially be a plot device that highlights Walt's obsession with purity with no adulterants. The Nazi Party was formed in Munich, Germany, which is in Bavaria, which has a blue and white checkered flag that mirrors the blue color of the meth. Blue also likely refers to Prussian blue, a compound with the chemical name iron 3 hexacyanoferrate 2, which was discovered in Prussia, or modern-day Germany. In Nazi death camps in the gas chambers, the Nazis used Zyklon B, which is a pesticide that used hydrogen cyanide as its primary component. When HCN comes into contact with iron oxides, it slowly forms traces of Prussian blue, which is why some of the gas chambers used during the Holocaust had blue residue on its walls. The first arc represents the invasion of Poland, which is complete on October 2nd, when Crazy 8 is killed by Walt, and the start of his partnership with Jesse, who represents Poland for all of the reasons mentioned in the pilot and above. The aftermath is also known as the Phony War period, where England and France, while having declared war on Germany, do not actually attack Germany outside of economic warfare. From October 4th to October 13th, Walt goes from quitting the business to asking Jesse if he wants to cook again. On October 6th, Hitler speaks before the Reichstag, wanting to conference with England and France for peace. And on October 12th, the French decline Hitler's offers of peace. And October 13th, a German submarine sinks the British battleship HMS Royal Oak. On October 8th, Hitler escapes a bomb blast assassination attempt in Munich, the same day Walt and Jesse escape from Tuco, who is killed by Hank. This Phony War period completes into the events of the second season arc, which is marked by Walt and Jesse attempting to be their own distributors in the meth business. Walt and Jesse's plan to attempt to go it alone somewhat mirrors Hitler's predicament, as he did not expect France and England to declare war and had to reorient his war plan around this development. On November 14th, Jesse is kicked out of his aunt's house, and on the same date, the Polish government in exile is moved to London. On November 23rd, Polish Jews are ordered to wear Star of David armbands, around the time Jesse moves into a new apartment owned by Mark Margolis, Jane's father. The reason this is significant is because Margolis is a specifically Ashkenazi Jewish name. On December 18th, Germany wins the Battle of Heligoland, an attempt by 3 squadrons of the British Royal Air Force to destroy German capital ships, which resulted in a German victory as he destroyed 12 out of the 22 bombers and repelled the attack. The same day, Walt tells rival drug dealers to stay out of his territory. Now in 1940, on February 10th, the USSR agreed to supply grain and raw materials to Germany in a new trade treaty. Around the same date, Walt and Gus make their first business deal for the 38 pounds of meth that he had previously cooked with Jesse. The USSR also was involved in a war against Finland, as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact made between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia agreed that Finland would be in Russia's sphere of influence, while Germany agreed to assist the USSR by blocking supply lines from England and France. On March 5th, Finland capitulated to the Soviet Union. On the same day, Mike Ehrmantraut, who is Gus's fixer, is introduced and cleans up Jesse's involvement with Jane's death, further entrenching Gus into Walt's own sphere of influence. The third season starts as Walt is now working for Gus full-time, while managing Skylar's discovery of his activity. In the World War II timeline, the Phony War is nearly over, while the Nazis prepare for the invasion of France, which starts on May 10th. During this time, Winston Churchill pushes for a more aggressive approach against Germany by launching Operation Wilfred, beginning the Norwegian campaign that lasts until June 10th, which damaged German shipping heavily, but ultimately resulted in a German victory. Around this time, Hank amps up his investigation of Heisenberg after blue meth has resurfaced. He ends up finding the RV and nearly catches Walt and Jesse, but ultimately fails due to Walt's phone call to Saul using Marie as bait, which secures their escape. Enraged, Hank then loses his job by assaulting Jesse, and subsequently gets hospitalized when he is shot by the cousins. Meanwhile, the treaty between the Soviet Union and Germany mentioned earlier starts to kick in, as the Soviet Union would provide Germany with raw materials in exchange for German machinery, manufactured goods, and technology. Stalin was most interested in the cutting-edge Lutzow cruiser because of its state-of-the-art naval guns. The invasion of France begins May 10th, at which point Walt agrees to Gus's contract of making $15 million a year to work for him indefinitely, who is convinced by Gale that Walt's product was impeccable. By May 10th, while the Battle of France was not officially over, the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, calls Churchill, the new prime minister, that "we have been defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle." Churchill himself would fly to France in an attempt to boost morale, but would find that they had no strategic reserve, and would later say that it was the most shocking moment of his life. On around the same day, Schuyler agrees to launder Walt's money, seeing it as a necessary evil in order to pay for Hank's medical care, which Hank and Marie cannot afford. We learn later on that Schuyler's maiden name is Lambert, as Walt uses this as his alias when he goes into hiding, which instead of German is a French surname. We can now conclude that Schuyler is meant to represent France. Meanwhile, as Germany is busy with France, the USSR conducts the Katyn massacres of Polish officers, starting around April 3rd. On the same day, Gus invites Walt to dinner, to which he advises him, never make the same mistake twice, somewhat implying that he should not do business with Jesse, who represents Poland, as he sees him as a liability because of his meth addiction. The next day, Jesse discovers that Andrea's brother Tomas had killed Combo under orders from Gus's dealers. When plotting to kill the dealers himself, Walt tells Gus, who then tells the dealers not to use any more children. However, the dealers end up killing Tomas as a result, and Jesse decides to once again kill the dealers, at which point Walter intervenes and kills them himself to save Jesse's life. Gus now sees both as a liability and wants to kill them both. On May 25th, the USSR amps up its aggression against the Baltic states, who had become protectorates of the Soviet Union after the fall of Poland, but have growing Nazi sympathies as anti-Semitism is rampant. The Soviet government accuses Lithuania, a country that had received Polish territory as part of the agreement to be a protectorate, of kidnapping Soviet soldiers. At this time, Jesse finds Gale, Gus's chemist that he groomed ever since the death of Max, and kills him to save Walt, ending the third season. The fourth season is a cat-and-mouse game with Walt and Gus, which drives the main story, but is unrelated to the real-life timeline. However, while the allegory does start to break down in service of the main plot, some aspects of the parallel storyline still continue, while Gus's past with the cartel gives us clues as to how his story matches the real-world timeline prior to World War II. We will deal with the former for now, but leave the latter storyline for part 2 when we examine Better Call Saul, which more fully develops Gus's story. On June 22nd, the Franco-German armistice is signed. On June 21st, Schuyler is worried about Walt's behavior with Hank, correctly speculating that Walt is hiding the degree of danger that he is in, to which Walt responds with its famous speech about being the danger. Shocked by this, the following day she considers leaving with Holly to safety, but ultimately decides to stay with Walt. Meanwhile, on July 4th, the German News Bureau captures and publishes documents during the fall of France relating to Operation Pipe, an Anglo-French plan to bomb Soviet oil fields to prevent Soviet shipments of oil to Nazi Germany. Around the same time, Hank informs Walt that he's investigating Gus and enlists his help, while Walt informs Gus of his investigation. On July 10th, the Battle of Britain begins, which ultimately results in a British victory. On the same day, Walt purposely triggers a car accident to delay Hank's investigation of the laundromat where Gus's lab is located. Gus then tells Walt that he's fired and that he will deal with Hank himself. After the season ends with Gus's death, the timeline in the final and fifth season no longer follows the parallel structure, except for two final moments. On March 19th, London suffers the worst of the Luftwaffe firebombings with heavy damage from incendiary bombs, while Plymouth and Bristol are bombed again. On the same day, Hank is killed by Jack Welker, a neo-Nazi gang leader. On September 6, 1941, Hitler issues Directive No. 35, the formal order to prepare for the main offensive against Moscow, which ended as a massive failure that was the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. During the night of September 6th to 7th, Walt saves Jesse from the Nazi gang, liquidating the entire gang himself with an M60 machine gun, but also accidentally shoots himself in the process and dies. And finally, one last moment that doesn't fit the timeline, but does for the allegory. When Walt gets rid of Gus's men, including Mike's lawyer, he has Jack Welker's gang murder them all in 3 separate jails within a 2-minute window. The operation is super complex, but Walt confidently tells them, "That's what I'm paying you for. Figure it out." This models the Nazi advance into Russia, Operation Barbarossa, where the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union from 3 separate locations, the largest land invasion in global history. It is also Walt's final triumph, as the last half of the season is his ultimate downfall. Now that we've laid out the parallel story, let's go over the characters to finish up the allegory. For this section, I'm only sticking to characters I feel confident about. Besides Walt, the show centers on his two main antagonists, Gus and Hank. Gus Fring as Joseph Stalin. As a quiet, soft-spoken dictator with mysterious origins, Gus speaks Spanish as a Chilean, the way Stalin spoke Russian as a Georgian, somewhat of an outsider looking in. He builds an underground forced labor superfactory in the desert, with political officers watching every cook. The Los Pollos fleet is the 5-year plan on chicken wheels. The Pool Massacre, walking into Don Eladio's compound smiling politely while the entire old guard leadership chokes to death on poisoned tequila, is the closest Hollywood has ever come to filming The Great Purge in real time. Gus, cold, calculating, and ruthless, doesn't raise his voice. He just decides you no longer exist. Half his face blown off, but still walking like death itself, is the most Stalinist death scene ever shot. Hank Schrader as Winston Churchill. Big, loud, and somewhat racist, Hank is an alcoholic bulldog who spends 5 seasons roaring that Heisenberg is out there while the entire DEA laughs at him. He makes his own German beer and drinks it like Churchill drank Pol Roger wine. Hank is crippled by the cousins, as Churchill gets crippled later in life from a stroke, both eventually using a cane to walk. Hank's minerals phase is literally Churchill hiding in the country house painting landscapes while waiting for the world to catch up to his warnings. Defiant to the end, he tells Jack Welker, "My name is Asac Schrader, and you can go fuck yourself," mirroring Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech as France fell to the Nazis. As these characters go to war with Walt, the rest of the cast gets caught in the crossfire. Jesse Pinkman as Poland. Poland was invaded and partitioned by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in 1939. The super lab chains, the deaths of everyone he loves, the beatings he takes, the lab in the neo-Nazi compound, and the box under the ground. Jesse literally lives the entire Polish experience. "He can't keep getting away with this," is Warsaw screaming while the tanks roll in. Skylar White as France. Starts as the anxious Republic witnessing Heisenberg's rise, collapses the second Walt declares he's the one who knocks. Spends the second half of the show as Vichy France laundering money, cooking books, and keeping the lights on. Her maiden name is Lambert, which is a French surname. The scene where she forces Walt to stay away from the children is the Free France resistance attempting to protect French colonies from falling into Axis hands. Marie Schrader as Clementine Churchill. Marie is a loyal wife who keeps Hank alive through every breakdown and hospital stay. She protects Hank at all costs, the way Clemmy smuggled brandy past doctors. The loyal wife that sits at his bedside, refusing to leave while he screams about rocks, pure keep the home fires burning energy, while her bouts of kleptomania, her unforgiving nature, and her depression mirror Clementine Churchill's own struggles with mental illness and anxiety over finances. Walt Jr. as Hitler Youth. Breakfast-worshipping kid on crutches who idolizes his dad, but also starts calling himself Flynn to sound tougher. Born on the day parallel to the beer hall putsch, Walt Jr. represents the birth of the Nazi movement. He defends Dad at the breakfast table like it's 1938 as a badass. The phone call in Granite State, where he finally realizes the truth and tells Walt never to come home again, is the Hitler Youth generation waking up in 1945 when the war is lost. Jane Margolis as the 1930s German heroin drug underworld. The seductive opiate culture was quietly tolerated by the Nazi regime until it threatened productivity. Walt watches her choke to death and does nothing. That's the exact moment the Reich decides the junkies have got to go, no matter the collateral damage. Saul Goodman as Emil Maurice. Maurice was an actual Jewish founder of the SS who got a personal letter from Hitler declaring him an honorary Aryan because he was too useful to kill. Saul Goodman is a fake Jewish stage name, but drives the Fuhrer around and manages his empire. We'll go over his disappearance into a black and white Cinnabon and his past as Jimmy McGill in Part 2. Mike Ehrmantraut as Lavrentiy Beria. Gus's calm grandpa's secret police chief is a loyal cleaner, spy, and enforcer for the Chicken Man's meth empire. We'll go into this more in part 2, but Beria is Stalin's NKVD chief who was removed from power and executed shortly after Stalin's death. Lydia Rodart Quayle, Anastas Mikoyan. Lydia is Walt's inside supply chain manager who can move 1,000 gallons of methylamine out of a German company, Madrigal in Hanover, without a trace. She's paranoid about footprints, always talking about ocean freight and leaving no trace. The rice and tea scene is her finally getting purged for trying to flip the supply line. Mikoyan was a Stalinist, but sided with Nikita Khrushchev against an attempted coup by Stalinists, who was later then removed from power when Khrushchev himself was replaced by Brezhnev. Todd Alquist as Heinrich Himmler. Todd is a neat, polite Boy Scout who shoots a kid on a dirt bike and then asks if anyone wants coffee. He runs the slave cook with ice cream and a smile. Himmler was an admirer of Hitler, but ultimately betrays him at the end of the war, attempting to secure his own safety by fleeing Germany instead of standing his ground to the end with the Führer. Victor as Viktor Semyonovich Abakunov. Victor was the guy for Mike, the box cutter scene. One tiny slip up in front of the subordinates and you get your throat cut on the concrete as an example to the rest of the workforce. No trial, no explanation, just blood and back to work. Abakumov was a high-ranking official in the NKVD as a deputy of Beria and was executed for his role in the Stalin-era purges in 1954. Ted Beneke as the Duke of Windsor, or Edward VIII. Ted Beneke is basically the Duke, rich, tanned, smiling corporate playboy who thinks he could flirt with the danger without consequences. He sleeps with Skylar, or marries the American divorcee, cooks the books to dodge taxes like the Duke dodged duty, face plants running from the IRS the way the Duke fled to the Bahamas when the war got real. The Duke was openly pro-Nazi, gave the salute, visited Hitler, thought he was a good fellow even after the war. Ted's smug, I've got this handled vibe while everything collapses around him is the perfect stand-in for that corrupt, out-of-touch royal who wanted peace with the devil. Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, the Viennese Jewish bourgeois elite. According to Walt, Elliot stole his research and his girl, the way Hitler claimed the Jewish Academy stole his genius. The birthday party charity offer is the final insult that pushes him from frustrated teacher to full Heisenberg mode. Jack Welker and his gang, Hans Adolf Prutzmann, and the Werewolf Nazis. The Werewolf Nazis were a late World War II Nazi German plan for a partisan resistance organization launched in late 1944 as the Allies advanced into Germany, meant to conduct sabotage, assassinations, and harassment behind enemy lines to disrupt the occupation and buy time for a potential German recovery or negotiated peace. They then became post-1945 Aryans, who dig up the buried gold barrels and keep cooking after the Führer is dead. Prutzmann was the overall werewolf commander appointed by Himmler, while the rest of the gang sports tattooed swastikas on their necks like it's still 1946 and the Fourth Reich is one good batch away. So there you have it, the theory complete, where Breaking Bad was meant to be both a character study of the two most polarizing figures of morality in the West, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, while also calling into the question the universally accepted figure of Western liberal morality, Winston Churchill. There are little bits and pieces that could also fit, but since this is already extremely long in the tooth, I'll leave some of the rest for y'all to find. I hope I have done a convincing enough job in presenting this theory. But wait, what about Hector Salamanca and the Salamanca clan? These characters will be fully explored when we go into Gus Fring's own backstory in relation to Joseph Stalin in Part 2, as Better Call Saul splits into two essential plotlines, Jimmy McGill's own transformation into Saul Goodman, and the origins of Gus Fring's meth empire. I will also delve into an analysis of Gilligan's intentions and my overall thoughts of the show's philosophy itself. If you enjoyed Part 1, be sure to like and subscribe to catch the next parts when they are released. Thanks for watching.